Just what is wrong with Rock Hudson? Tonight, the 59-year-old actor remains in a Paris hospital undergoing tests.
Here now the news. Actor Rock Hudson dead. His year-long battle with AIDS at an end. He was 59.
There are some stories that were never meant to be opened, and yet once they are, they refuse to close again. For decades, a set of documents sat in silence, locked away in a place where no spotlight could reach them. Pages filled with clinical notes, test results, and final observations, written in handwriting that had no idea the world would one day treat them like evidence. They belong to a man who spent his entire life crafting an image powerful enough to eclipse the truth and fragile enough to shatter the moment anyone looked too closely. Those files did not just contain medical details, they contained the one thing Rock Hudson guarded more fiercely than fame, the story of who he really was, when the cameras finally stopped rolling. And when the world got hold of those pages, when they were released after years of legal battles, family protests, and public speculation, the silence that had protected him broke open like a wound. What emerged was not just information, it was a revelation that cut deeply through the people who loved him, who fought for him, who believed that even icons deserve a space where memory is allowed to remain private. But the world has never been gentle with its legends, especially the ones it misunderstands. To most people, Rock Hudson was the perfect man, a cinematic dream carved into celluloid, a symbol of romance, masculinity, elegance, and everything Hollywood wanted audiences to believe. Yet behind the polished charm was a fragile architecture of secrecy, a structure built not by vanity or pride, but by necessity, by the unspoken rules of a system that rewarded beauty, punished truth, and demanded silence as the price of survival. He lived within those boundaries for years, and when illness came, it came with consequences the world was not prepared to face. His medical files became more than records, they became weapons in a cultural war no one, including him, had the strength to fight. A war between privacy and curiosity, between dignity and exposure, between a family trying to protect what little remained of him and a world desperate to claim the final piece of the man it had adored. Some of what those documents revealed was expected, some was heartbreaking, some, as historians later noted, clarified rumors that had followed him in whispers, and some details his loved ones insist should have died quietly with him. Yet here we are, decades later, still trying to understand why the release of those files ignited so much anger, reopened so many wounds, and left his family feeling betrayed all over again. Because the truth is simple, Rock Hudson spent his entire life protecting secrets, and even after death, those secrets still had the power to hurt. What was buried inside those files? Why did their release feel like a violation of a man who had already paid so much? And why, after all these years, does his family remain furious, not at him, but at the world that refused to let him rest? Before we can answer that, we must return to the silence he lived in, the silence he was forced to keep, and the silence that ultimately became the heaviest burden he ever carried. Because nothing in those medical files makes sense until you understand the cost of being Rock Hudson. Silence has a weight to it, a quiet pressure that grows heavier the longer a person tries to carry it. And in Rock Hudson's world, that silence didn't begin with illness, it began much earlier, in the narrow hallways of a studio system built on illusion. Hollywood in the 1950s was a kingdom of shadows. Public images were crafted like porcelain statues, glossy on the outside, fragile underneath. Every actor understood the unwritten rules. Image was currency, image was safety, image was everything. But for Rock, the price of maintaining that image was higher than most people ever realized. Behind the posters, the premieres, and the magazine spreads was a man who learned to measure every smile, every gesture, every answer to every question, not out of vanity, but out of survival. A single misstep could collapse the empire built around him, a single whisper could end the career that defined him, and the whispers were always there. Some came from studio executives who monitored his personal life with the same precision they used to calculate box office numbers. Some came from agents who encouraged carefully staged friendships and strategically timed public sightings. Some came from journalists who sensed there was more to his elegance than the roles he played. And some came from people who claimed to know the truth. Though much of what they suggested was no more than speculation, fragments of rumor wrapped in envy, fear, or fascination. But the tension didn't come from the whispers themselves. It came from learning to live above them, knowing that one wrong moment could let them rise to the surface. This quiet battle shaped every corner of his life. There were parties where he laughed more loudly than he felt. There were rooms where he looked for exits before he looked for faces. There were friendships that grew complicated under the pressure of everything that could never be said. And there were relationships, real ones, meaningful ones that unfolded behind closed doors, carrying the constant knowledge that discovery was not an inconvenience, but a threat. Every choice became calculated. Every word became deliberate. Even joy had to be measured. The world adored the version of Rock Hudson they were allowed to see. But the cost of protecting that version was a loneliness few people ever recognized. As the years went on, the tension deepened. Hollywood changed around him. New stars rose. New stories were told. But the rules that governed his personal life remained the same. Silence was still demanded. Privacy was still policed. And the persona he projected became less of a role and more of a mask he had learned to wear with grace. Until everything shifted. When illness entered his life, it did not announce itself with drama. It arrived quietly, the way the most devastating truths often do, through fatigue that didn't go away, through symptoms that didn't make sense, through a vulnerability that felt unfamiliar and frightening. At first, the silence that had once protected him now became a cage. Doctors' visits became discreet appointments made under layers of secrecy. Medical results were guarded more carefully than film scripts. Questions about his health were redirected, softened, or avoided entirely. His inner circle tightened. The people who cared for him most felt the weight of what they couldn't say, and the studios, fearing scandal, fearing fallout, fearing anything that might tarnish the spotless image they had built, encouraged him to stay quiet. But secrets grow heavier when the body grows weaker. Behind closed doors, the tension grew into something larger than privacy. It became fear, not of the illness itself, but of what its revelation would mean, not just for him, but for the legacy that had taken a lifetime to build. There were moments when the truth pushed against the walls he had constructed, moments when he considered revealing everything simply to breathe freely again. But the world in which he lived was not a world that offered kindness to vulnerability, so the silence held, and the tension tightened. And those closest to him, the ones who saw not the star but the man, began to understand something painful. This wasn't just a medical battle, it was an emotional one, a psychological one, a battle between self-preservation and self-erasure. Years later, when the medical files were finally released, people focused on the facts inside them, the timelines, the diagnoses, the clinical details. But what those pages could never capture was the emotional terrain surrounding them, the strained relationships, the careful decisions, the secrets that held everything together and pulled everything apart. The world saw the symptoms, his loved ones saw the silence behind them, and as the illness progressed, that silence, once protective, began to feel like the very thing that would destroy him. Something was coming, something inevitable, something no amount of careful image crafting could prevent. The breaking point was approaching, quietly and steadily, and when it finally came, it would change more than just the story the world thought it knew. It would expose the truth he carried alone, and it would ignite a fury within his family that still has not faded. There comes a moment in every life where the truth can no longer live in the shadows. For Rock Hudson, that moment did not arrive with a grand announcement or a sudden revelation. It arrived slowly, as a collection of small defeats the body could no longer outrun, the exhaustion that lingered too long, the weight loss that seemed impossible to hide, the pain that refused to be dismissed as stress or overwork. At first he tried to maintain the illusion, not for fame, not for vanity, but for the fragile structure of his world. Silence had always been his refuge, the place where he felt safest. But illness has a way of rewriting boundaries. It demands honesty, even when honesty feels dangerous. His inner circle saw the change before the public did. They watched the vibrancy fade, the energy dim, the spark that had once lit up entire rooms soften to a flicker. They offered support in ways that did not expose him. They made the phone calls he couldn't make. They answered the questions he couldn't bear to face. But illness is not patient, and it does not negotiate with fear. Soon the truth pressed harder. Medical visits grew urgent. Treatments grew invasive. The quiet battle he had been fighting became impossible to conceal. There were whispers among journalists, speculation, theories, and rumors labeled as such, many of them inaccurate, most of them intrusive. Yet even the speculative noise felt like an echo of a truth that was inching closer to the surface. Hollywood, once his protector, became uncertain. Executives feared publicity. Assistants were instructed to deflect inquiries. Publicists crafted explanations that sounded polished but hollow. And Rock, the man who once held the screen like he held his breath, now found himself holding on to the only thing he still controlled, the choice of whether the world would know. But the illusion finally broke in a way no one could prepare for. In the summer of 1985, the truth became unavoidable. Photographs began circulating, capturing an unguarded moment, a version of Rock Hudson the world had never seen, a man thinner than the legend, quieter than the persona, struggling with a reality far heavier than fame. Those images traveled quickly. The public asked questions. The media dissected every frame. Speculation hardened into assumption, and the silence that had shielded him for decades suddenly felt like an accusation. It became clear that this moment, this irrevocable fracture, would change everything. It wasn't simply that he was ill, it was what his illness represented in a world unprepared to confront it. His diagnosis, kept private for as long as possible, collided with a cultural fear the world had been avoiding. The stigma surrounding his illness was sharp, unforgiving, and steeped in misinformation. To reveal it was not just to share a medical truth, but to expose himself to a level of scrutiny no one deserved. And yet, when the truth finally emerged, it shifted history. His announcement, made out of necessity rather than choice, became the first major public figure acknowledgement of the disease. It forced conversations the world had tried to ignore. It turned fear into visibility, and it left Rock exposed in a way he had never allowed himself to be. The breaking point was not his confession, it was the cost of it. Friends noticed how the weight of scrutiny pressed down on him, how the language surrounding the illness, cold, clinical, often cruel, stripped away the humanity beneath the headlines, how even acts of compassion were tinged with the world's discomfort. The illness weakened him, but the exposure drained something deeper, the sense of privacy he had spent a lifetime defending. And in the final months, as he retreated from public view, the silence that had once been protective now felt like something taken from him, not something he chose. Every test, every symptom, every fragile hour was documented, studied, interpreted, and speculated upon, in life and later in death. Those intimate details, once held in trust by the people who cared for him, would one day become the very pages the world demanded to see. The medical files that would ignite controversy were written during this period, not as a story, but as a record of a man's final battle, a battle fought not just against illness, but against exposure, against misunderstanding, against a world that did not yet know how to hold compassion for someone like him. The breaking point, then, was not a single moment. It was the slow unraveling of everything he had worked to protect: his health, his image, his privacy, his silence. And when the medical files were eventually released, years later, they didn't just reveal facts. In the years that followed Rock Hudson's passing, the world continued to speak his name. Sometimes with admiration, sometimes with speculation, often with a level of curiosity that bordered on intrusion. But for his family, the story did not end with grief. It entered a quieter, more complicated phase: the battle over what the world deserved to know and what should have remained only theirs to carry. The medical files became the center of that struggle. At first, they lived where such documents always do: protected, confidential, preserved only for medical necessity. They weren't meant to be public. They weren't meant to be pored over by strangers searching for meaning. They weren't meant to become evidence in debates about culture, illness, or the way history should remember him. They were simply the final notes of a man who had endured more than anyone realized. But time is relentless, and so is public fascination. Researchers requested access. Biographers pushed for transparency. Journalists argued that Rock Hudson's story had become bigger than privacy. Court filings were made, appeals were submitted, and slowly, the silence he fought so hard to maintain began to erode under forces no longer within the family's control. When the files were finally released, they arrived not as a revelation, but as a rupture. People expected scandal, they expected secrets, they expected something explosive enough to justify the years of demand. What they found instead was something far more fragile: a man fighting for dignity in the final months of his life. The documents confirmed known facts. They clarified timelines. They outlined symptoms and treatments in clinical detail. They showed the steady progression of an illness that reshaped public understanding in the 1980s. But they also exposed vulnerabilities that were never meant to be examined. Moments of weakness, physical decline, private struggles written not as history, but as observations meant only for care. And that was the part his family could not accept. To them, these files were not historical artifacts. They were intimate remnants of someone they loved, a person whose final chapter had already been too public, too scrutinized, too debated by voices who never knew him. The release felt less like truth and more like reopening a wound that had barely begun to heal. They argued that the world had already taken enough from him. The performances, the persona, the privacy he sacrificed without ever saying a word. What remained should have been his alone. But history rarely grants such mercy. As scholars dissected the documents, as commentators reframed his story, as films and articles emerged using those details to analyze his final days, one reality became clearer. Rock Hudson had become a symbol, not just of Hollywood's golden age, but of a turning point in cultural understanding. His illness had forced a conversation that changed public perception. His acknowledgement had broken a silence that shaped medical history. And his final records, even if painfully exposed, helped illuminate the human cost of secrecy and stigma. Yet the price of that illumination was steep. Even now, his family remains protective, not out of shame, not out of denial, but out of love for a man who spent a lifetime being looked at, admired, and dissected, and who deserved at the very end the simple grace of being understood rather than exposed. Some truths enlighten, some truths heal, and some truths only reopen the questions a person never had the chance to answer for themselves. In the quiet aftermath of the file's release, one thing became undeniable. Rock Hudson's legacy was no longer just the films he made, the roles he played, or the image Hollywood crafted for him. It had become a mirror reflecting the very thing he had feared and carried in silence: the world's struggle to reconcile its love for a star with the truth of the man behind him. His story is no longer simply about what he kept hidden. It is about the cost of hiding it, the courage of living it, and the tenderness required to understand it without judgment. In the end, the world learned the medical truth, but only a few ever understood the emotional one, because some secrets don't disappear when the files are opened. Some continue living in the hearts of the people who protected them, long after the rest of the world has moved on. And perhaps that is where his real story still rests today, in the silence he left behind, and in the love that refused to let his final chapters be defined by clinical words on a page. For more quiet stories the world tried to forget. You know where to find RetroWaves.